Good morning. Good. Good morning. We're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Layla Bermeo from the Museum of Fine Arts Boston, and I'm here today with Jackie Francis of California College of the Arts, Andine Chavoya of Williams College, and Asma Naeem of the National Portrait Gallery. We will be talking about critical race art history, reading, writing, teaching, and curating, and as this lengthy subtitle suggests, this conversation will explore intersections between academic and curatorial work. Part of the inspiration for this discussion grows out of a community learning initiative that I have worked on with Marcy Kwan, who is professor at Stanford University, and Caitlin Beach, who is completing a dissertation at Columbia. We assembled a series of bibliographies that are related broadly to topics of race and art history. So using these very unwieldy, slippery categories like African diaspora, Asian American, Asian diaspora art, Latinx, Latin American art, First Nations, Native American art, we assembled these long lists, long reading lists, which live free and open on the website of the Association for Critical Race Art History, or ACRA, an organization that some of you may be familiar with, which was founded by Jackie Francis and her colleague, Camara Holloway. We also organized a series of reading groups in Boston, Washington, D.C., New York, and the Bay Area that choose texts from these lists based on the interests of the group and meet monthly to discuss them. These groups have been really interesting because they have drawn people from across fields and professions. So in addition to art historians, we see anthropologists, musicologists, scholars of comparative religion and literature come in to discuss these readings, which are all based on art history with us. So this means that we have created beautiful spaces for interdisciplinary learning, but it also means that we face the challenges of communicating with each other across fields, across terminologies, methodologies, and experience levels. And this is something that I think that we can keep in mind over the course of this conference as we talk about breaking down boundaries and collaborating, whether within our own institutions or across institutions. It's always going to be easier to work by yourself or to work with someone who is exactly like you. And so when collaborating, even just keeping in mind that collaborations require extra time and patience, I think is something that can be really productive. And I'm so honored to be up here today with some of the most thoughtful people who have experience with exactly these types of projects. None of us have actually been to AAMC before, so I actually get to be double honored to not only be here with you, but to moderate this panel of amazing scholars who will now introduce themselves to you through little mini presentations of their work. And we're going to get started with Jackie, because her development of the framework of critical race art history is part of what inspired today's discussion.
So thank you to AAMC for inviting me to this panel, and especially to Layla, who organized it. Montreal is such a great city, and I'm glad to be back here, and this is my first time in this venue. And I feel like I'm in a great gathering, like Seneca Falls or Niagara or Wittenberg or Montgomery, Alabama. But I'm not Susan B. Anthony or Sojourner Truth or Martin Luther. And I'm going to read just to keep on time. In 1998, I started to think about something that I hoped could be a method for looking at race and racialization. Critical race art history is a term I came up with to describe a comparative approach to investigating and analyzing the central role of race and the central role of visual representation has played in the construction of race, a category that continues to matter. In 2012, I published this book to try out critical race art history. The historical use of the term racial art was one that I discovered when researching the interwar career of the African-American painter Malvin Gray Johnson. Critics and other observers and patrons often use the term racial art, which I've been putting in quotes, to contextualize and discuss his work. Johnson's contemporaries, the Japanese-American Kuniyoshi and the Polish-Russian-Jewish-American Weber, faced similar reception. And all three artists at different times of their careers talked about their modernist practices, expressionists, romanticists, a sort of middle-brow modernism. They talked about their practices as outcomes of their essentialized identities. Racial art was something that early 20th century Americans looked for in the work of these ethno-racial minorities. And as is the case in almost every situation, when you look for something you want, you'll find it. Critical race art history is indebted to the writings of 20th century critics and observers on African American artists' work. Alain Locke, an African American intellectual trained in philosophy, sought to make these artists' production more visible in a culturally pluralist American society, as he viewed it. Locke was influenced by Herderian Volksgeist notions and Irish literary nationalism. Each group, he thought, contributed its distinctive gifts to a nation. Yet critical race art history, I think, is different from the content area studies fields, such as African American art history, Asian American art history, Native American art history, as we talk about it in the US, and Latin American art history. As critical investigation, critical race art history is a discussion of operations and ideologies. Frankfurt School critical theory and critical race theory have influenced my thinking. Yet the latter, especially critical race art history, can bring about change in a way that art history has not and maybe cannot. This is all fine. But I've sometimes considered critical race art history a failure. The aha moment about racialization has been slow to come. But I have to cut myself some slack. Race is useful in a variety of ways. The literary scholar Kalpana Seshadri Crooks and others have told us racialization is not going away. Race blindness is neither possible nor desirable to most people because race is a value. For this reason, critical race art history, unlike the ethno-racial subject areas, is not grounded in a politics of correction. Instead, I follow social art historian Janet Wolf's politics of interrogation, and I keep trying to figure out the possibilities in psychoanalytic theory. Like Seshadri Crooks, I think that there is something in psychoanalysis that can help us, or maybe help me, work through the fantasies of stable subjectivities and move me or us toward encounters with our limits. This is my last slide. How can I get where I want to go with critical race art history? One way to do this is to make the familiar strange. This collaboration between Pollock and Namath was driven by identity politics and a desire to increase a certain subjectivity and visibility of racialized identity and its wholeness. Wrapped as it is around sex and gender politics, the master signifier here is whiteness that promises everything, and for that reason always needs shoring up. In the US now, the anxiety around whiteness is a visible representation in popular visual culture. You know what I mean, and I don't have to bring a slide in to show you. The fact is that in short order, we in the United States will have to rethink and shift certain terms, such as majority and minority as applied to ethno-racial bodies. This means that critical race art historians still have work to do. Our work will be done in institutions, academic and museums among them, for audiences are already looking for it there. What if the wall label, the tombstone for a Pollock painting, identified him? What would be thrown into relief about identity histories and collective practices if it said, white American artist? Thank you.
Good morning. Thank you all for being here, and I'm so grateful to have this opportunity to be on this remarkable panel. Thank you to AAMC for the opportunity, and to Layla for the invitation. So from the perspective of an art historian, both interested in and dedicated to Chicanx and Latinx art, one of the major questions and hurdles that continually arises is, where do you go to encounter and study these materials? And the answer has largely been, you go to the artists. And in more recent years, let's say the past 15 years or so, you go to the archive, and largely university archives that have made it a priority to collect, catalog, preserve, and make available materials on Chicanx and Latinx artists for research. And here I'm thinking of places like Stanford University Libraries, thanks to the efforts of Roberto Trujillo, the Chicano Studies Research Center at UCLA, led by Cho Noriega, that has been arduously processing and digitizing a vast assortment of materials, and the California Ethnic and Multicultural Archives at the University of California at Santa Barbara, where the Institutional Archives for Self-Help Graphics, San Diego's Centro Cultural de la Raza, and San Francisco's Galeria de la Raza are housed alongside the collections of art historian Shifra M. Goldman and other folks like Sean Carrillo. And another important collection to note for Chicanx and Latinx materials is, of course, the Smithsonian Institution's Archives of American Art. As a professor and a curator who sometimes curates, my focus over the years has been on collaboratively developing research-driven exhibitions in areas that have not received widespread art historical and curatorial attention. I've generally worked with artists without markets and without gallery representation, and thus largely not in museum collections, and have relied, as I've tried to indicate, on university archives as the spaces for collection and preservation. And this is due plainly to the fact that museums have been particularly slow in collecting Chicanx and Latinx art, particularly through the 1970s, 80s, 90s, and into the 2000s. With the Access Mundo show and in other projects that I've worked on, the work is often, the research has often involved working directly with the artists, as I've indicated, but also with family members, surviving partners, friends, and/or band members, as the case may be, working in homes, garages, attics, storage units, etc. And in some cases, this has facilitated, this research has facilitated the collection, the depositing, and the preservation of some of these materials in archives, such as UCLA's Chicano Studies Research Center and the One National Gay and Lesbian Archives, who I partnered with and collaborated with for the development of the Access Mundo show. Before Access Mundo, the major project that I worked on was the OSCO retrospective, OSCO Elite of the Obscure, that was a collaboration between the Williams College Museum of Art and the LA County Museum of Art. This was a long-term, multi-year project with multiple and complex components developed in collaboration with a close colleague, Rita Gonzalez, curator of contemporary art at LACMA, and coordinated between two very distinct institutions with incredibly different institutional cultures and methods. After an extensive and demanding 3-year tour, the exhibition that crossed multiple borders and surpassed nearly all expectations came to a close in Mexico City in July 2013 at the MUAC on the campus of the National Autonomous University of Mexico. And just when I had survived the PTSD from the first PST, the second one came around, and I was happy to jump aboard. I should also note that with the OSCO exhibition, I want to be mindful of my time, but I do think it's important to note that with the OSCO exhibition, Rita Gonzalez, my co-curator, and I had been working with those artists since we were graduate students. And I had had my first conversation with the artist Gronk from the OSCO group while an undergraduate intern at the San Jose Museum of Art when I was about 20 years old. So when we started developing this retrospective exhibition, it wasn't like the institution was coming to knock on the door. It was, people that they had worked with for many, many years. More recently, I had the great pleasure of working with David Evans-France from the One Archive on the Access Mundo show. And what we tried to do in this exhibition was highlight a heterogeneity of practices that we found when digging deep into the work of artists from the late 1960s and early 1970s, and highlight this experimentation across genres by multiple artists, and highlight different forms of collaboration. The heterogeneity of media proved a challenge sometimes for the institution MoCA that we were partnering with for various reasons. The show maps the intersection among a network of queer Chicana and Chicano artists and their artistic collaborators from the late 1960s to the early 1990s. It includes over 50 artists and groups, showcasing how they experimented across a variety of media, including painting, performance, photography, fashion, video, music, mail art, and zines. Significantly, not all of the artists presented in Access Mundo are Chicanx, and nor would all of the artists identify as LGBTQ or queer. Artist networks are defined by permeability and exchange, and so we tried to follow the model set forth by the artists themselves, and in that way, we hope the show is expansive, highlighting connections and coalitions across ethnic and racial heritage and sexual orientation. And finally, I just want to say that this was a show that involved multiple arenas of collaboration, multiple constellations of collaboration. The show was organized, as I mentioned, by the One National Gay and Lesbian Archives, which is the world's largest LGBTQ archive. It's now a part of USC's libraries and has a curatorial department of one. Who is my Access Mundo co-curator, David Evans-France, who is here. Hi, David, in the audience this afternoon. The exhibition was part of the Getty's PST LA initiative and was gratefully supported by the initiative with its research and implementation. And our ambition and budget for the exhibition was always way beyond anything that One had developed previously. So because of the ambition of the show, One did not have ample space in its galleries, and we were thankfully able to partner with MoCA. So the exhibition was in 2 venues, at MoCA PDC and at the One Gallery. The show is now beginning its tour and will open at Hunter College this summer. And the tour is another form of collaboration for us. The tour is being managed by ICI independent curators. Thank you.
Good morning. Thank you to AAMC. Thank you to Layla for inviting me to be part of this panel. And I'd like to also thank the organizers who have put together all the nitty-gritty details, Lucy Leiden, Hannah Teskey. I'm Asma Naeem. I'm a curator at the Smithsonian National Portrait Gallery. And I wanted to just quickly lay out the parameters of the Portrait Gallery and talk about several problems related to our institution, and then give 2 quick case studies so that we can then get to a discussion. So the Portrait Gallery was founded in the 1960s, and its mission is primarily the intersection of art, history, and biography. And primarily, we're trying to tell the story of the American people through people, men and women, who have made significant contributions to American history and culture. That's our mandate through Congress. We get approximately 1.3 million visitors a year. We're a free institution. We have a range of visitors, such as the family of 5 coming from Minnesota on spring break, to professionals who work in Washington, D.C. and come to enjoy our courtyard. So I wanted to just show you one of the main attractions for our museum. This is our American Hall of Presidents. And of course here you see Gilbert Stuart's Lansdowne portrait of George Washington. Some of you may have heard we added 2 more portraits to our collection recently. I don't know if you have heard of it. So it's Kehinde Wiley's portrait of President Obama and Amy Sherald's portrait of Michelle Obama. And we're very excited about the energy around these two portraits and the attention that portraiture has received from these two new acquisitions. At the same time, the portrait gallery is a complex set of practices and collecting habits. If you think about it, portrait galleries occur in nations or are established in nations that are colonial powers. There's no portrait gallery in India, for example. There's no portrait gallery, I believe, anywhere in Africa. The National Portrait Gallery is a locus of power and a locus of nation building in such places as London, Australia, and yes, the United States of America. So in effect, portrait galleries are a kind of myth-making and chest-beating and whatever other kind of analogy you want to draw upon and calling attention to the greatness of a certain country. Realizing this and realizing that the orthodoxies upon which the National Portrait Gallery has been built include such things as American exceptionalism, manifest destiny, the Hall of Worthies, if you will. I call this the first problem that I and my colleagues, some of whom are here today, we are trying to circumvent in very surgically precise and nimble ways, given our lack of resources, because we are a federally funded institution. So that's problem number one, is our institutional mission related to the National Portrait Gallery. Here I'm showing you an image of our first floor. It's called the American Origins Galleries. And this shows the history of the United States from the point of contact to approximately the Gilded Age on the first floor. And I show you two examples of some of the portraits we have on the first floor. Benjamin Franklin, the 1785 portrait by Duplessis that is now on the $100 bill. And then, yes, this is Pocahontas. It's an unidentified artist, and it's based on a Van de Pas print from 1618. And you can see readily the second problem that we have at the National Portrait Gallery, which is portraiture has been, from the time of the antiquities, an instrument of power, a way to promote a specific propagandistic message, and particularly with oil on canvas, is an elitist medium. So Pocahontas would not have been painted in oil on canvas, but for the fact that she made a royal visit and somebody in England decided to capture her likeness. And the fact that this is the only way that we can represent Pocahontas in this anglicized costume and with anglicized features is itself a second problem. The genre of portraiture is a problem. And some of you may now be wondering, why is she working there if she has so many problems? Yeah, so the other thing I should note, and we can talk about this more because I feel like I'm running out of time, is the contemporaneous nature of portraitures that we tried to add to our collection. Meaning we will not add a contemporary artist's rendition of Pocahontas to our collection because there's a seemingly indirect connection to the subject. So that's another topic for discussion. So given these problems, I have been devoted to focusing on issues of portraiture that are more egalitarian, more democratic, and I here now do a shameless plug for my silhouette show, which is opening on Thursday, and thus my early departure today, so I'm sorry if I don't get to converse with all of you. Silhouettes I consider to be the earliest form of democratic portraiture before the invention of photography in 1839, and I explore the historical and contemporary iterations of portraiture, of silhouettes as portraiture. and as a contemporary art form in the show. But I should now bring up two very important points about my background that I feel inflect my worldview. The first is that I am not an American-born citizen. I'm a naturalized citizen. My parents came from India because of the problems due to partition, and I was born in Pakistan. So again, you can see this colonial impetus that inflects my worldview. The second thing is that my previous life as a criminal prosecutor in Manhattan under Mayor Giuliani where I saw firsthand, and this is actually not that funny, where I saw firsthand the problematic and dehumanizing set of practices that have now led to what we now call the Black Lives Matter movement, led me to leave the law. So based on those two things, when I walked into the portrait gallery, I quickly realized that I didn't see people who looked like me, and I did not see many other populations represented on the walls. And so I quickly decided, along with my other colleagues in the curatorial staff, that we needed to show in the portrait gallery that everyone is welcome at this civic institution. Museums are intimidating places. Many of the populations I worked with in my previous life would never even think about walking into a museum. And I find that very disheartening. Everyone deserves a place at the table. And in that sense, I also feel that interns on up to senior management at museums need to be more diverse. So this led me to seek out portraits of different kinds of populations. And believe it or not, we had, in terms of Muslim Americans at the National Portrait Gallery, 3 individuals. I would ask any of you to scream out a guess of who they would be. Yes. Malcolm X? Yes, one more. Oh. That's a good one. That's a good one. Is that Jonathan? Hi, Jonathan. Yeah. So yes, and Elijah Muhammad. And Elijah Muhammad is the last one. And so I felt that Americans and visitors to our museums didn't realize that Muslims have been here from the very beginning. Muslims have been a part of the African diaspora into the United States. And so because of a piece I heard on NPR, I realized that there was a portrait that was available at the Georgetown branch of the DC Public Library of an African slave who was later freed and who was Muslim. And this is the story of Yaro Mahmoud. Yaro Mahmoud was painted twice, and the other portrait is by, of course, Charles Wilson Peale that hangs in the Philadelphia Museum of Art. And I wanted to just also say that I've written a brochure about this, which I will leave here at the stage for all of you to read, about Yaro Mahmoud's life. Installing his portrait in the National Portrait Gallery's American Origins Galleries, being able to discuss the diversity of this individual's background, the adversity that he faced as a shackled object who was transported across the Atlantic Ocean and forced into servitude for over 44 years and then later freed and able to buy his own home in Georgetown is I think, a story that needs to be told. So very quickly, I will now end talking about my current project that I'm working on with my wonderful, brave colleague, Taina Karagal. Is she here? Taina Karagal curated Ken Gonzalez Day's part of this show that we currently have up at the National Portrait Gallery. It's called Unseen: Our Past in a New Light. This was a moment of institutional critique for us. So you can see now how I'm kind of getting a cathartic moment in my practice. We are acknowledging that the portraiture tradition has been elitist, and we are asking 2 contemporary artists. Ken Gonzalez Day is one of them. I was going to go into his background, but he is basically working with lynching photographs and also museum objects that show an ethnographic tilt, if you will. And so Taina worked with him. I worked with Titus Kaphar, who is currently living in New Haven, and due to his time at the Yale University Art Galleries, where he got his MFA, he realized very quickly the racializing practices of historical portraiture. This work here of Thomas Jefferson, Behind the Myth of Benevolence, nods to the undisclosed or previously heretofore unacknowledged situation with Sally Hemings that led to 6 children. And so I will quickly move ahead to my final slide, which is Titus's 2 portraits, fictitious portraits, of George Washington's slaves. He had over 300 slaves on Mount Vernon. One was Billy Lee, who was his valet, and the second was Ona Judge, who was Martha Washington's valet. Ona Judge escaped. She didn't run away, she ran too, as many African American historians describe it. And she ran to freedom, and she had a family. We have no images of what these 2 individuals look like. There's no way to have a contemporaneous likeness in our collection. And Titus's efforts, I feel, are a beautiful poetic way to explain that. And as Kara was just talking about in the previous panel, this absence tour, I would like to give that a little more heft as well in our museum. Thank you.
So thank you. Thank you, all 3 of you, so much for those rich introductions to your work, which I think pull out a lot of different strategies for making visible stories of artists and historical figures who have been marginalized within museums. I'd like to start with a very boring practical question about interpretation. So here I'm thinking specifically about wall labels and texts, but this could also work for other interpretive tools like video or even giving tours. I think within our field, there tend to be stereotypes on both sides. So curators often suggest that academics use jargon that nobody can understand, and academics often accuse us of dumbing down complex ideas, and the 3 of you have raised a lot of very complex ideas. So can you talk a little bit more about some of the strategies that you use for teaching these ideas, specifically about race and identity to broad publics within exhibitions?
Prompted by thinking about the suggestion of identifying the Namath Pollock piece as a white American. It recalls for me when we did the OSCO show at WICMA, at the Williams College Museum of Art, we were asked for the first time to define the term Chicana and Chicano and produce a didactic that explained the definition, something that we did not do at LACMA and which I outrightly declined to do at WICMA, because my response was, I'll happily write the label that defines Chicano for you, but only if you do it for every other cultural designation that you identify in the museum. And I was like, good luck with that, right? And in some ways also, like when it came time to doing the OSCO exhibition catalog, for all of the contributors and writers, and we had a wide array of interdisciplinary scholars, it was such a relief for so many of them that they didn't have to spend the first 1/3 of their essays defining the term and its history, which seems to always be the kind of burden of having to provide that first. And it's like the entire first third of your essay is done before you even get to start to talk about the art or the artist. And I just think that's a demand that's not placed on all cultural groups, and it comes from this kind of maybe misunderstanding or projection that our audience won't understand that. And my response to that is it gets explained through the context, right? And it gets explained through the work in a variety of ways. When the show went to Mexico City, in Mexico City, a timeline was produced, which was appropriate, I thought. It was a kind of historical and cultural timeline, kind of identifying important moments in the Chicano civil rights struggle. However, I remember explicitly in our engagement with the press in particular, what was very difficult for the press and many of the museum staff in Mexico to understand is that Chicanos were and are a historical population in the United States. They only wanted to frame it or recognize it within a contemporary context of immigration, right, and not as a historical presence and related to kind of incorporation and colonialism. And then the other thing that I think about with labels all the time is that labels can't or shouldn't kind of alienate either the core audience or the audience or subjects that are being represented as if they are a foreign group. And here, I think a little bit about the challenge we had with the Getty recent PST initiative. You know, Chayat Day was hired to do this elaborate campaign, the kind of There Will Be Art campaign. And the first promotional slogan that was presented for Access Mundo Queer Networks in Chicano LA was, the slogan that Chayat Day produced was, "There will be gays in outdated outfits," which we had to explain to them could be offensive and would alienate our core audience. I'll end with that. Thank you.
Labels are a sticky wicket for us at the museum because we are trying, we're, I believe, the first Smithsonian institution, maybe Eduardo can confirm this, yes? Yes, we're the first Smithsonian institution to have bilingual labels, one in English, one in Spanish. And so this seems like a very noble idea. It, of course, creates very problematic issues for us, the curators, in terms of wall space. So we're given about 140 words per label. And so the complexities, the nuances of a person's biography, the critical historiography in terms of art history of a certain object, some of these things cannot be explained in 140 words. At the same time, I think the other issue is the nature of audience. Many people come into the Portrait Gallery wanting to hear a specific story about our nation, wanting to hear a specific story about our presidents. So, you know, if we suddenly go into the mass genocide that Andrew Jackson created with his Trail of Tears and the Cherokee tribe west of the Mississippi, we have to do that in a very careful way. So I believe that labels present a set of challenges on a practical level, just in terms of how we as curators can create language that will cut through all of these different layers very quickly, just in terms of wall space as well, and then in terms of audience.
Great. So a follow-up question that is also about formats. I wonder if you can talk a little bit about the differences between creating an exhibition, teaching a class, or writing a book. And in answering this, maybe think about how academic and curatorial work have changed over the last couple of years or over the course of your careers. Perhaps particularly as we hear within university communities, concerns about a crisis in the humanities, or perhaps a comparative situation would be museum workers' concerns about relevancy, which is a conversation that we're having a lot. We could start actually with you, Jackie, because you are a full-time professor. You don't have to make exhibitions at all. So why? Why make exhibitions? What is it doing that is different from the work that you're doing in a classroom?
I do an occasional curatorial project, often in collaboration, because sometimes I want to make a show that I want to see. Because sometimes I'm frustrated by the kinds of shows that I see, or I'm frustrated by the way they are presented. And so rather than complain all the time, I'm trying to make an intervention. I think that sometimes in academia, you have a lot of space, and presumably a captive audience that you can control as the professor. And so you're making an argument and trying to show its logic. You're not so much making an argument assuming that it's right or wrong, but you're trying to at least make something that someone can follow in terms of how you frame what you're talking about. Presumably that would also be the case in the museum setting or even the commercial gallery setting. But it's not so because, again, as people have said for the last couple of days and certainly here on this panel, museum audiences aren't always, no matter who they are, feeling at home in institutions. They certainly come to us as museum curators or gallery curators as authorities. And even though there's so much research, at least in the last 10 years, that museum audiences don't want to be told what to think, I still think the majority of people do want that. And I certainly know people who do want that. I think they cede that power to the institution. So it's just two very different dynamic settings. And I know that I've never had a family member in my class, but I've gone to museum shows and gallery shows with family members and seen how they react to what they see and how different it is from the way my students act when we go to museum exhibitions, and certainly when I go to museum exhibitions with my colleagues. And I don't mean to draw a stark distinction between academic world or museum world and the real world, because as an academic, I know my world is real as well. But it's just realizing how many different tactics and strategies we have and we have to deploy when talking about the work we care so much about.
In some ways, I think I want to talk about, if I can, the impact of the importance of the exhibition catalog. Because I do firmly believe, and I think I learned this with the OSCO show in particular, is that the exhibition and the exhibition catalog, as opposed to the academic monograph, has the greatest and most immediate impact, not just on the curatorial field and on the museum world, but in academic and art historical curriculum, but also interdisciplinarily. So I think that that's something that in seeking that type of impact for previously under-recognized artists and groups, that the exhibition and the exhibition catalog format seems to me to have yielded the greatest results, and as I said, kind of had the greatest impact. The irony to that, at least from the academic perspective, is, and some of you I'm sure know this, is that academic institutions don't recognize or value exhibition catalogs in the same way for things like tenure and promotion as that they do with academic monographs. And there's also the other kind of tricky question there, and this did come up with the OSCO exhibition, is there's also different relationships to intellectual property, right? So for instance, at Williams College, as a faculty member, I own my own intellectual property. However, my colleagues that work at the Williams College Museum of Art do not. And so those are also, I think, important considerations and negotiations that have to happen during these points, at these points of collaboration between people working in academic institutions and in museums.
Osman, do you want to say anything about your book, since you brought your beautiful exhibition catalog with you, and if you were able to, what you were able to accomplish differently within that project that is different from the exhibition?
Yeah, given, I think, exhibition catalogs are something that curators who also want to exercise their writing muscles really enjoy. You get to have a much deeper dive. This exhibition catalog for me was an opportunity to bring in different voices, amplify different strands that were running through the exhibition that I otherwise would not have had the opportunity to expand upon. So I had a conservator from Harvard University Art Museums who is the preeminent expert on silhouettes, Penley Knipe. contribute an essay to talk about the materiality of these wonderful objects. But I also had two mentors and scholars in the American art field, Alexander Nemerov and Gwendolyn Dubois-Shaw, who both readily agreed to take this deeper dive into looking at silhouettes, but readily acknowledged that this would do nothing for their careers. It was purely an intellectual exercise that they realized would satisfy their own innate curiosity. But very interestingly, there were donors who responded immediately to the fact that I had approached this show with this scholarly ambit, and so money came very quickly, believe it or not. So I feel like this is an opportunity that is giving me hope for the future.
My last question will be about collaborative projects, which all of you have sort of hit on. But I would love it if you could think a little bit about sustainability. So how do collaborative projects, whether you are the person coming in from the outside or whether you're working with people from the outside, how can they change institutions? So the reason I bring this up is because something I worry about is how conversations about collaborations, outside voices, and diversity are often collapsed with little acknowledgement about how collaborative projects might inform long-term commitments to, say, diversifying exhibition programs, collecting efforts, or full-time benefited staff. So Jackie and Ondine, I wonder if you could talk about how your relationships with some of the people and the institutions that you've worked with have perhaps continued into the future. And then Ozma, if you could offer some examples of how working with collaborators has sort of shifted things within the NPG.
I think that collaborative projects are probably the way that so many, certainly North American institutions are going anyway for cost reasons since 2008, even as institutions mine their collections, which is good. I was very much interested in the previous panel's discussion of that. But I also think that it's because museums have the opportunity to be Kunsthalle-like spaces anyway, and I think about a non-collecting institution that I've worked with in San Francisco where I live called the Museum of the African Diaspora. And rather than collect, which is, an expensive gambit, I think that that institution and others, even those that collect, have an opportunity to really be a space for conversation, because of course that's what art objects can do. They can be the medium through which we talk about things that are sometimes hard to talk about without some sort of mediating force. And I'm also thinking about, in addition to the exhibition catalog, just the different ways in which we communicate what we're doing. My friends here who know me, I know that I don't really do social media very much. It's kind of pitiful. But I do think that certain kinds of social media, certain kinds of digital platforms have the sort of distribution impact that exhibition catalogs don't have. And it doesn't mean everything has to be boiled down to 140 characters or to an Instagram post, but it does mean that we have to do a better job of communicating what's going on in different, again, formats. People don't have any problem downloading a new video, but they will have a problem downloading an exhibition idea, much less the text of a catalog. And I just think that kind of collaboration across different communicative outfits, not just the newspaper exhibition review, but things like radio stations and social media platforms is so critical.
Briefly, in terms of kind of sustainability and this question of, can these types of collaborations change the institution? I think this is a really important question that many of us that were involved in either, the second, the first, or both of the Pacific Standard Time initiatives consider and are thinking about and rethinking now in this moment of reflection, since, in so many instances, the kind of the labor, the intellectual labor, the curatorial labor with the expertise in Chicanx, Latinx, and Latin American art was not housed within the museum institutions itself, there were people like myself and many others that were kind of contracted to work temporarily on this project-specific exhibition. And so, the question still remains what impact or effect that will have within the individual institutions and within the museum structures more broadly. To that point, I can say that in terms for Access Mundo, it's because of the earlier PST exhibitions that David Evans-France, my co-curator, and myself had participated in that we were able to actualize Access Mundo. I don't know that this show would have been possible or legible to the Getty or to any other institution, for that matter, if David hadn't had done his show Cruising the Archive at the One Archive or the OSCO show. I will continue very gleefully to work with David, and we're currently talking about a project, a monographic project on one of the artists in Access Mundo. And I'm very happy that a good number of materials from our research ended up at the One National Gay and Lesbian Archive. So they now actually have this tremendous collection on Chicanx art that wasn't there before as a result of the initiative. So that is a way in which the institution itself, and through its collections, can change, and certainly we hope it will foster and promote future scholarship and research in this area that will also help to put this work in new contexts as well, even beyond the context in which we framed it for the exhibition. And, in terms of the OSCO show, I can say, WICMA actually made several, purchases, acquisitions out of that or related to that exhibition. So Williams now has probably the largest number of OSCO works anywhere in the United States. The Smithsonian has also, the American Art Museum has since collected some pieces. The Whitney has collected some pieces. But I don't know that LACMA ever did, right? So, it was such an important exhibition for the institution and is so relevant to their history. But I don't know how that exhibition has kind of fostered additional kind of developments there. So.
I'm thinking of two conversations I had yesterday, one with Erica Hirschler and the other with Greg, who was on the panel yesterday. Is Greg here? I guess not. But I think in terms of collaboration, it's crucial because, as per my conversation with Erica, there is only a certain number of hours per day that we as curators can devote to building knowledge in fields outside of our expertise. I am trained as an American art historian. Any knowledge that I have of African American art history, thanks to the fantastic work of Jackie, was because I took a class devoted to African American art history. And so these silos of knowledge that we have within the academic disciplines spill over into the museum world. So what we've done in the past is we've brought in scholars, say, of Asian American art, and we've had them literally drop knowledge on us for an entire day, talking about the history of Asian American art production in the United States, so that we can then go out and try to collect and exhibit works by people from these populations. So I think it's really, the invisible labor that we as curators all do, the dreaded cataloging, and, I'm sorry, I hate cataloging, but other people may enjoy it, but the things that take us away from the more public aspects of our duties and knowledge building, I think require extensive collaboration.
So we have about 10 minutes for questions, and then can always continue with our conversations over break. Right here.
Hi, thank you. I'm Pam Franks. I work at the Yale University Art Gallery, and thank you so much for this inspiring discussion and for all of your remarkable work in critical race art history. Given that so much of what you've talked about today is taking place at the intersection of academic and museum work, and picking up on your last question, Layla, I wonder if you could share any examples of student collaborations, ways that students have participated in the research or the curatorial process, or any other way, really, that has been particularly productive for their learning. And it goes to your point earlier, Ondine, also of promoting future scholarship.
In the sorry. So the model, the exhibition that I didn't talk about really answers that most directly, and it was a Robert Rauschenberg exhibition that was co-developed with Lisa Doran, and that was an exhibition that was kind of a collaboration between myself as a professor, Lisa from the museum, and the Rauschenberg archive, and it was really about giving our students access to the archive and developing an entire curriculum and pedagogy around the archive, archival practices, the archive in relationship to exhibition making and scholarship. And the students actually developed an exhibition that was on display in the museum for several months, kind of out of their research, out of their kind of encounters with archival materials. And it was a little bit of an ungainly exhibition, but it was a fun experiment because each student kind of had their own autonomy to select their own objects and to pursue their own research. And then Lisa and I, as curators, kind of had to kind of bring it together in some ways while still honoring their own research and interests and highlighting that, while also trying to give it a larger framework so that it would also be accessible and hopefully somewhat enjoyable to an audience as well. So that's one example.
Hi, this is Elliot Davis. In full disclosure, Layla and I worked together, but I didn't know anything about the content rather, but it was a terrific panel. I wanted to ask Ozma about the William Lee portrait and how you were able to circumvent in that unseen exhibition, but somehow you were not able to with Pocahontas. I ask that because we, of course, have an imagined image by Sully of William Lee in our own galleries, which it's on a painting that's 12 by 17 feet. So we would love to be able to show him and also Oni Judd in a very different way. So I wondered if you could speak to that for us, please.
Thank you for that question. It's a great question. This is a temporary exhibition. I didn't have time to go into it. Yeah, so we have a contemporary space devoted to the most cutting-edge movements in portraiture called Portraiture Now. And in that space, we're able to kind of do away with the history and biography elements of our mission and really just focus on portraiture. So I would really love to have Billy Lee and Ona Judd represented in our collection. And I'm trying to actually acquire a piece made by a Baltimore-based artist of Nat Turner, because Nat Turner was never imaged during his life. So these kinds of issues are deeply ingrained in our institutions. I think our audiences would be willing to suspend disbelief, if you will, and go down that road of seeing contemporary works in our historical galleries that are created kind of looking back, but obviously with an informed and deeply committed impetus by the artist. But yeah, it's a temporary exhibition, so Titus's imaging of Billy Lee and Ona Judd will be going back to the owners.
Hi. Is this on? Yes. Hi, I'm Anna Marley. I'm at the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts. Thank you for your amazing talk. And all of you, I was struck by something one of you said. I wrote it down. I can't remember who it was, but it was that labels shouldn't alienate visitors. And I love that idea. But the question I have is, thinking about all the different museum audiences that we have coming to our museum. And also the great disparity between who we want to be visiting our museums and the people who are controlling our museums, literally our board members. And I'm working on a show on 19th century history painting. And I gave a talk to an old Philadelphia club a few weeks ago, and they actually interrupted my talk 2 pages in and said, "But do you mean these paintings are propaganda? Are you saying that history paintings are propaganda?" And I said, "Well, yeah, kind of, but I'll finish my argument." So when you have a painting like Penn's Treaty with the Indians, which is an icon for some people of an event that happened, particularly your older, more traditional audiences who might also be giving you a lot of money, but then you have new audiences that you want to come and reinterpret your collection and feel welcome and feel like we can change the discourse around that painting. Maybe talk about it as propaganda. How can you do that with wall labels, and how can you do that, change the structure of the museum, but also keep your board members happy?
We have Ondine, and I don't know, Ondine, if you want to speak to part of that, but Ozma, maybe you might have something.
Thanks, Anna, for that
It's a
question.
separate panel.
What I have noticed, I will say, with Unseen, and Taina can discuss this as well, is that we are seeing a new kind of donor. It's kind of like, and I hope you'll forgive this analogy, but what President Obama did with his initial presidential campaign in gathering money at a grassroots level that was in smaller increments. We're seeing people who would have never walked through the doors of the National Portrait Gallery suddenly saying, yeah, I can see myself here now, and here's, $50 kind of thing. I do think it's a deeply problematic, but I think relationship that we have with donors. It is the nature of the beast, as we all know. But I also think that some donors are willing to be pushed in ways that we probably didn't think that we could push them, especially given the current political climate and the various ways that vulnerable populations are feeling threatened. So I think that's something that we can push a little harder on with donors. But I also think, there's all these fabulous foundations like the Ford Foundation that are really committed to the same values that all of us are invested in this forum anyway, that we could tap into and not so much rely on the traditional donor, so to speak.
Carmen has a question. She needs a mic.
Good morning. Thank you for your wonderful panel. I had a question for all of the candidates, for all of the panelists, which is, how do we make whiteness more visible? Right? What are the strategies to do that? I know that Asma, your show with Taina, does that in a way through an exhibition, but I'm wondering about different interpretive strategies that allow us to make it more visible for our visitors. I know recently there was an article in Hyperallergetic about, I think it was the Worcester Museum, that had a whole sort of additional set of labels that made connections between, portraits of people with connections to the slave, to abolition and the slave industry and all of that. So I'm just wondering if you knew of, and you can speak of examples of projects that make whiteness visible.
I'm not a white studies scholar, but no, I mean, there's a feel, right? But I do think projects like Martin Berger's Sight Unseen gives you a roadmap in terms of paintings. Like, how is it that emergent US genre painting of the 19th century, like by Mount, Fair Exchange, talk about a construction of a white subject in the post-bellum South? What is the privilege that is given to that individual who can take a hat off a scarecrow and not have it be discussed as theft? And I think that's what I mean about the construction of race and racialization as an ongoing project. And similarly, things like Matthew Fry Jacobson's book that was quoted in my slide presentation, David Ignatieff, no, I always mix up the Ignatieffs, How the Irish Became White, etc. And just to see it as an ongoing project, I think is one way to do it. And it can be seen through our history as a visual representation.
One thing that I would just add is that I think for museum audiences, we can simply pull out some of the differences between representation and self-representation. So I've thought about this mostly in the context of African American art and Native American art, but highlighting when someone is representing themselves versus if it is a picture, a portrait that is created from the outside. I actually think that will help us make whiteness more visible as well, just even as a very small way to do that. I think we have time just for one more question.
Just to your point, though, Layla, that these racializations are made by all groups. So certain kinds of African American portraiture of the 1920s does not look like African American portraiture of the 1960s, at least was what's collecting. And there's something happening that's very dynamic that has to be charted. So again, even when it's in-group or out-group or whatever you want to say, there's something that's happening that's extremely mindful and purposeful and should never be naturalized.
Anybody for the last question? Okay, well, thank you so much, this incredible group of panelists. Thank you, AMC. And we'll continue the conversation.